economic growth, and the need to reinforce efforts to fully embrace the focus on strengthening international cooperation and promoting inclusive global value chains. I would welcome on dais Ms. Mallika Srinivasan, Chairman and Managing Director, Tractors and Farm Equipment Limited. Mr. Veer S. Advani, Vice Chairman and Managing Director, Blue Star Limited. Mr. Amitendu Palit, Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead, Trade and Economics, Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore. Ms. Linda Kromjong, President M4E. Mr. Damo Ravi, Secretary Economic Relations, Ministry of External Affairs. Mr. Som Prakash, Honorable Minister of State for Commerce and Industry. Mr. Piyush Goyal, Honorable Minister of Commerce and Industry, Textiles, Consumer Affairs, Food and Public Distribution. And virtually we have with us Ms. Shinta Kamdani, Chief Executive Officer, Centessa Group. We welcome all of you. We welcome all the dignitaries on the dais, please. Honorable Minister Sirs and the eminent speakers of the industry, we welcome you all for this session on building resilient global value chains, advancing inclusion and integration of all. I now request session moderator Ms. Mallika Srinivasan, Chairman and Managing Director, Tractors and Farm Equipment Limited, to take over. Over to you, ma'am.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to all of you to this plenary on building resilient global value chains, advancing inclusion and integration of all. It's with great pleasure that we have with us a guest of honor, the Honorable Minister, Mr. Piyush Goyal, Minister for Commerce and Industry, Textiles, Consumer Affairs, Food and Public Distribution. As an ardent devotee and a proponent of free and inclusive global trade, he has led India's external engagement with great dexterity that has resulted in enhanced trade flows, both in terms of imports and exports. He has also redefined India's strategies on free trade agreements and finalized FTAs with UAE and Australia in record time, with several others under discussion. His guidance will be invaluable for the discussions today. So welcome to this session. And I'd also like to add that the Minister has expressed his keenness to have a more interactive session, and thank you for that. So I'll request all our panelists and to stick to our respective time allotted so that we can and encourage the participants here to raise their questions with the Minister. So a little change of format, but I think a more interesting change. So thank you for that. We're also privileged to have with us Sri Somprakash, Minister of State for Commerce and Industry, who brings to his portfolio decades of rich experience in policy formulation and administration, having been a member of the coveted Indian Administrative Service for over 3 decades. So we look forward to your experienced insights in today's deliberations. And I thank all the other distinguished speakers at this plenary for your kind participation. Developments in global trade have dominated headlines over the last few years and become an increasingly key imperative for governments and businesses all over the world to focus on, given that global value chains have played a key role in stimulating economic growth, boosting investments, creating jobs, and building further the respective strength of each participating economy. Despite the widely reported rise in protectionism and bilateral trade tensions, global trade of goods and services reached a record level of over $30 trillion in 2022, signaling resilient global demand. Trade in services has proven to be particularly resilient and posted an increase of 15% year-on-year in 2022, as compared to a 10% increase in global goods trade in the same period. Investments have rebounded too, post the pandemic. Governments around the world are being proactive in reshaping supply chains by offering attractive investment schemes for investors. With this backdrop, while FDI flows dropped 17% post-pandemic, they recovered to pre-pandemic levels.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
$4.6 trillion. However, despite the broader positive outlook, there are some global trends that require us to build resiliency into our global value chains as a priority. Bilateral trade tensions among major trading blocs have intensified, leading to an imposition of rising tariffs and sanctions. The outbreak of the recent military conflict led to a variety of restrictive measures which significantly impacted global supply chains. We are now at a point where formal trade restrictions are estimated to impact $1.4 trillion of trade among G20 countries. Restrictive trade and investment policies have also impacted FDI activity. And these factors give rise to expectations that there is a significant shift in trade mix likely. Global undercurrents have also had second-order effects, leading to disrupted production, higher prices for consumers, limited consumer choices, misallocation of resources, and loss of jobs. Hence, there is indeed a pressing need for us to address the resilience across the ecosystem. In the midst of all this, it's nice to note that Asia has emerged as a leading light globally. While FDI inflows into developed economies dropped, there were record inflows into emerging economies in Asia. Asia's share of global FDI inflows has seen a consistent increase, capturing 40% of global FDI inflows in 2022, underscoring the resilience of Asian nations. 2022 saw India become one of the fastest growing countries in the world and complete a successful emergence out of a pandemic-induced slowdown. In 22, India's real GDP grew at 6.9%, proving that a large country with a democratic, pluralistic system can achieve significant economic growth and development for its people. In parallel to its surging economy, many eyes are on India's population growth as well. One estimate would put India's population at estimated 1.47 billion at the end of 22 as already 5 million in excess of China's. And in any case, is certainly expected to be the most populous into 2023. India's ambitious foray into the global economy with its human capital and entrepreneurship has underlined its leadership among the emerging and developing economies. The global focus on the India growth story is indicative of its growing importance in accelerating international development and cooperation and strengthening multilateralism. India has historically been an active leader and participant in the G20 processes on the Sherpas and finance tracks. Its support for global cooperation, inclusive development, economic stability, and sustainable growth is in line with its national goals as well as the values espoused by other leaders of the G20. As one of the most diverse nations in the world, India appreciates that inclusivity is the key to growth and will play a strong role in driving resilience, sustainability, digitization, and enhancing the services trade, to name a few of the issues. The past versions of the B20 have highlighted the importance of decisive policymaking in driving growth, inclusivity, and sustainability. They were able to advocate practical recommendations and support key policies in the face of the global pandemic and military conflicts. And in this context, I'd like to take this opportunity to recognize the good work done by our immediate predecessors, Italy and Indonesia, in developing comprehensive recommendations and defining aspirational targets. The B20 Italy team, in the face of declining international trade volume and plummeting FDI flow caused by the pandemic, made strides on strengthening international cooperation, preparing for future global emergencies, addressing inequalities, and promoting sustainable development. They recognize the importance of driving impact through measurable, actionable metrics, and were trendsetters in introducing KPIs and targets for 2024 with their recommendations. The B20 Indonesia team worked through a challenging global economic landscape, coupled with military conflict in Europe, driving forward the crucial role of trade and investment in supporting global economic recovery and resiliency. They highlighted the necessity of leveraging innovation and technology to multiply the benefits from trade and investment, and committed to an inclusive, close-looped pledge empowering MSMEs and women-led businesses. We would like to continue reinforcing some of the consistent themes that past B20s have driven forward. To name a few: inclusiveness and resilience of value chains, growing importance of sustainability, and facilitating easier cross-border trade with the use of technology. Keeping this in mind, there are 4 broad themes that are being proposed for discussion with task force and members, and for consideration. Fostering resilience and sustainability. In recent times, the pandemic, geopolitical conflicts, breakthroughs in vaccines, and the ongoing recovery have highlighted that building resilience and sustainability is a key priority. The pandemic wiped out $8.5 trillion of output from the market over the 2 years following its onset, and the global economic impact of the Russia-Ukraine conflict is expected to be around 2.8 trillion by the end of this year. It brings into focus the need for global coordination of crisis mitigation in a way that considers different starting points of each country. Globally, services trade, and this is our second theme, advancing the services trade to the next frontier. Globally, services trade contributes significantly to the overall trade volume, with numbers have been rising every year. Given the emergence of services as a key enabling backbone of manufacturing and other industries as well, there is an opportunity for significant advancement. Of the overall value of global trade, goods contributed nearly $25 trillion or 75%, while services contributed 7 trillion or 25, sorry, 75 I should have gone with first. More difficult to track, it surely is, the digitally delivered services, and so we can say that the numbers are perhaps underrepresented. The service value added per manufacturing sector today stands at between 28 and 30%. And therefore, services are becoming a key enabling backbone for manufacturing. Services trade needs to align with manufacturing, and easier movement of services across borders facilitated. Earlier references were made during the proceedings today on the use of technology in trade, and I'll just try to build a little bit on it. Trade and businesses are seeing a shift towards digitization and global e-commerce. Digitally delivered services went up from 52% of services to over 65% in 2022. Technology is the fastest growing motive for greenfield FDIs. Global greenfield FDI across all sectors in 2021, following a decline in 2020, increased 18.1%. But by comparison, the FDI projects in software and IT services increased 29.3%. Technology can play a pioneering role in advancing trade to its next frontier on multiple fronts. Through improvements in digital infrastructure and through pioneering use of Industry 4.0 tools in trade, it can enable trade to become more efficient, resilient, and inclusive. Promoting inclusivity across the ecosystem, there were a number of references to this even in our opening session today. Despite the rising global trade, we observe that some groups are still structurally disadvantaged from participating in global trade. Today, MSMEs represent 90% of businesses and more than half of employment, in some economies contributing up to 40% of national income. But 70% of women-owned MSMEs remain currently underserved by financial institutions. Access to finance is the primary barrier. Essentially, in emerging and developing countries, 131 million firms, 41% of the formal MSMEs in developing countries have unmet financial needs of $5 trillion annually. There is an opportunity to improve financial access for MSMEs and women by lowering regulatory burden and skill building. LDCs have not been able to keep pace with the growth witnessed elsewhere. GVC participation is therefore not merely a question of an international trade environment that is free, open, and inclusive. Inclusive GVC participation needs to go beyond this to look at capabilities within countries and how to build and strengthen these capabilities. In the last 3 years, the global trade and investment landscape has faced many unforeseen challenges. India, as chair of this year's B20, is committed to working constructively to emerge stronger out of any eventuality. We must continue to build on the work done by the past B20 committees and collectively drive effective and meaningful outcomes as seen by the people of the B20 and eyes of the world that are upon us. Thank you all for this opportunity. I'd now like to invite Mr. Damu Ravi, Secretary, Economic Relations, Ministry of External Affairs, to share with us his remarks. Thank you.
Honorable Minister for Commerce and Industry, Sri Piyush Goyal ji, Honorable Minister of State for Commerce and Industry, Sri Shom Prakash ji, my fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to all of you. So I don't want to go into details as to what GVCs mean because we are in B20, so it's obvious what it means to everyone. But I would like to throw some perspectives. We all know that GVCs are a complex process. It leaves one country, goes to another country, sometimes it comes back to that country, and it perhaps also crosses 2, 3 countries before it goes into the final manufacturing process. But at each stage, we need to recognize it creates value. That is the fundamental aspect on the meaning behind the global value chains. Now, let's look at it. Who are the most users of it? The micro, small, and medium enterprises are the biggest users or the biggest drivers of global value chains. And there again is the difference between how these are performed in developed countries and developing countries. In developing countries, because of their own structural issues, access to capital being limited, technology, so there is limitation in how far they can drive them vibrantly. Another important factor is the multinational corporations and the transnational corporations are the biggest beneficiaries of the GVCs because, again, the economics of scale decide as to where they source from. That's another important thing. But we can broadly say that countries that are open, countries that have consciously taken a decision to keep the policy transparent, tend to have more vibrant value chains driving those economies. Now let's look at the factors. The factors that support global value chains are very clearly, are very well known to all of us. The entry barriers and the exit barriers. Now, a country again makes a conscious decision how to improve them is the one which enables the vibrant movement of the global value chains products. This again comes to our mind, the trade facilitation. There, again, the way the countries in developing world and developing world differ because of the developmental challenges, that process in developing countries is slower. And again, the next item is we have tariffs and non-tariff barriers. This is a very, very sophisticated game. While tariffs are very clear, the non-tariff barriers are even more sophisticated game. So one is on the tariff. It is not so much about you lower the tariff, but it is more important that how predictable you make a tariff. But the developed countries use non-tariff barriers even more sophisticatedly to deny market access. And that is where is the debate today between whether developing countries, despite the Hong Kong ministerial outcome of 2007, which gave duty-free, quota-free access to many countries, still not able to access the market in the developed countries. And I think we need to revisit the debate as to what is missing there. We also need to look at the more conscious decisions that countries make in terms of the trade agreements. So countries that have greater free trade agreements tend to have a more access to GVC products. True, but we also need to recognize it is also creating some kind of an exclusivity within the trade architecture of the world. So exclusivity, which means it denies market access for some countries. Now, how do we address that flip side of it? Sometimes the GVCs only tend to look at, many countries tend to look at GVCs only from the goods point of view, but increasingly the manufacturing itself is becoming so complex and complicated, the services have a very big role in that. So we have to look at it in a more holistic manner, also address hindrances to services trade and how the digital tools can be enabled in that. The e-commerce is another important aspect of the GVCs. So while we recognize that it is important to have global value chains in the trade architecture, enable countries to make it happen, but the constraining factor is most often the nations are not able to understand the benefit right away because the gains from a GVC liberalization would happen over a period of time. So that is a time-consuming factor. So the ecosystem for that to happen will take some time, so which is why the manufacturing that goes along with it will pick up slowly. But it should be a strategic call of nations to see how much and how far they can enable a GVC to happen. Eventually, the gains will be larger, in my view, because the investments will start pouring in, the capital will start pouring in. Along with that, the technology will come in, and there will be greater job creation and a more sustainable economic activity. On balance, I would say the countries would need to look at GVCs from a more strategic perspective, because in the recent times we have seen that geopolitical tensions can impede trade, and in turn can also mean putting a large number of people around the world very, very vulnerable. We have also seen in the case of COVID crisis how the medical supply chains, they were affected, and again, several people in the world became very vulnerable. So it should become a strategic call. One of the things that the B20 can look at is discuss these issues more closely, come out with recommendations, and ensure that you are able to develop alternative supply chains rather than just depend on a region or a country. The risks are too much for us if we ignore that aspect of it. So what B20 could do, in my view, is enhance the awareness about the importance of GVCs. And this could be through capacity building, it could be through training, conferences, seminars, and even best practices learning. The second thing is we also need to understand why the DFQF have not really taken off. Why the share of developing countries and developed countries, LDC countries, are still so low in the world trade. I think we need to revisit the debate and come out with recommendation to make an improvement over that. Also, I think there is a need for recommending on bringing greatest transparency on the regulatory frameworks in each of the countries and make trade more predictable. And lastly, the importance of creating platforms and associations product-wise amongst the world trade. And this, I believe, the B20 is eminently capable of doing it, creating sector-wise associations, platforms, so that around the world, when B2B discussions happen, they know exactly which country has a product and at what value and what standard it is made available. These are my few thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ravi. Thank you for reiterating the emphasis on an open trade environment in order to create vibrant GVCs, for highlighting the challenges and issues that need to be addressed at the B20 deliberation, and urging countries to look at their GVCs from a long-term strategic perspective. Thank you. May I now request Mr. Veeradwan
Yes,
to address?
yes, I already unmuted.
Thank you, Chair.
The voice from the
Global
plenary
value chains
is
are one of
very,
the key
very.
drivers for
Oh
sustainable
my, I
growth
cannot
and
hear.
development of
It's like
the
very, very small.
GVCs are considered to be a powerful driver of productivity,
Yes.
growth, job creation, and increased living standards. Currently, the GVCs are much deeper in some industries,
Yeah.
such as electronics, automotive, or garments. However, I believe that there is tremendous opportunity for GVCs in many more sectors, including services, going forward. However, we must keep resilience,
Mine is
inclusiveness, and
afterwards, yeah.
technology enablement in mind when designing these new GVCs, as well as deepening the old ones. There are some points on this that I'd like to elaborate on. First, we need to think of policies to make global supply chains more resilient. We have experienced the case of semiconductors during COVID-19, and many other such sectors and products were affected. The issue of mobility restrictions and various government policies affected the networks of complex production. Therefore, we must look for structures, processes, and technologies which are resilient for businesses. Promoting regional trading arrangements, or RTAs, is a possible way to strengthen GVCs. I believe that the B20 should focus on strengthening these RTAs and making them more effective. Second, we need to strive for inclusion in all GVCs. The inclusion of least developing countries, as well as greater inclusion in terms of women, youth, and SMEs is critical for GVC growth. This can be achieved through targeted investments in 3 areas. The first one, infrastructure development. The second is upgradation of quality standards. And the third is the availability of trade finance that is cost-effective in each of these countries and these groups of participants. The B20 can play a larger role in ensuring progress on all three fronts to promote inclusiveness. Third, an important paradigm shift is happening due to Industry 4.0 technologies extending into trade. This is also called Trade 4.0. Some technologies like blockchain, analytics, IoT, and cloud will provide a strong positive impetus to trade by means of increased transparency and trade facilitation. Digitalization is also democratizing new possibilities for a more inclusive trading system by increasing the participation of women, SMEs, local agricultural producers, and remote entrepreneurs. But there are some other technologies like AI, automation, robotics, and 3D printing, which may erode trade volumes due to the elimination of comparative advantage in certain countries. And of course, digitalization is also leading to far more complex supply chains. It is therefore essential for countries to make large technology infusions in their trade systems and upgrade the skills of their people to implement and maintain these technologies if they are to stay relevant and to participate in future GVCs. The B20 should ensure that Trade 4.0 technologies and training associated with it is accessible to all these participants in this major transformation. Fourth, a radical shift is happening in GVCs as they are increasingly moving beyond traditional manufacturing into services and other intangible assets. Therefore, this provides a new model for exporting intellectual property across the globe. Factoryless manufacturing are already actively engaging in this trade. As we look to increase services trade, this is another area which can be explored in GVCs. My recommendation is that the B20 work quickly to update trade policy to reflect this new reality of intellectual property movement. The right strategies and recommendations will catalyze developed and developing countries to maximize and channelize GVC participation, and is of key importance to move towards GVCs-driven growth that is more inclusive, resilient, and technology-enabled. Thank you.
Thank you, Ved. Thanks for that emphasis on resilience and the suggestions towards structures, processes, technologies, and RTAs as a way of increasing this resilience. Your emphasis on inclusivity of women and MSMEs, and I must say, as he spoke on women and MSMEs, I was looking around, do we have enough participation? It looks pretty good on the stage over here, but perhaps doesn't look as good in the audience, and I'm sure it's not as good out there in the real world in terms of women participation in GVCs, but certainly something that we must add as a dimension to strengthen that further. And thank you for the emphasis on role of technology in future GVCs, highlighting the importance of IP as well. Thank you. Dr. Khalid.
Honorable Minister, Mr. Piyush Goyal, Honorable Minister of State, Mr. Som Prakash, distinguished chair, my co-panelists. Continuing on the theme and the tone which has been set since the morning and my previous panelists, on the subject of resilience, this is something which has been capturing the narrative on supply chains very, very centrally after the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's probably important to understand why there is so much of focus on the idea of resilience. There were supply chain disruptions that happened even before COVID-19. There was the Fukushima earthquake, widespread flooding in Thailand, Hurricane Sandy in the United States, Arab Spring upset a number of supply chains, and even normal cyber attacks, IT outages, they all led to disruption of supply chains. But these were all short-lived by their own lengths, sporadic in nature. But what happened after COVID-19 has been something which has been continuing with the world. My previous panelists referred to the semiconductor industries. The semiconductor industry is yet to come out of the woods. There's no clear assessment about when it will come, because the effects of the pandemic have been complemented by other events which were unanticipated and almost in the category of black swan events. The pandemic was hit by serious geopolitical developments. We do talk about the European conflict that's happening in Ukraine, but we do tend to forget that closer home to India, what happened in Afghanistan also had its impact on disturbing supply chains very severely. Now, this is an understanding which has probably turned around this entire idea of supply chains into a collaboration. The collaboration is that safeguarding supply chains is no longer just a prerogative of the firms and businesses. Governments need to come into the story, because supply chain disruptions are no more just firm-specific priorities, they are national priorities and global priorities, and that is why what we have seen after the COVID-19 pandemic is this flourishing of dialogue between the businesses and governments coming out with specific initiatives to safeguard supply chains. Examples of those are the very hearty conversations and engagement that are taking place in the B20 forum between the business and government representatives. The second point that I thought would be interesting to share in this context is that all the results that are coming out after the disruptions of supply chains from the COVID-19 do show that countries in the South, economies in the South, businesses in the South tend to get more than proportionally hit because of disruptions in supply chains. And there are some specific issues why the hits they take are that much more. Firstly, insofar as the actors and participants in the supply chains are concerned, they are much more employment intensive in as far as the participation from the southern economies are concerned. So to that extent, when supply chain disruptions occur, the costs and the hits on people are that much more, the displacement from the jobs are that much more. And secondly, the ability of these actors in the supply chains to come back to those chains post-disruption is that much more limited, because there are obviously limitations in capacities. One does understand that businesses need to be agile, businesses need to be flexible, businesses need to collaborate, businesses need to develop state-of-the-art facilities for coming back to the supply chains once they resume normalcy. But in all these indicators, the average small and medium enterprises from the global south is that much more behind than their counterparts in the advanced north. So this is a fundamental challenge, and when we talk about the B20 and we are talking about a combined global output of 86% of the world, we do need to understand that this 86% of global output impacts a lot of the output which is outside of it. For example, what's going on within the G20 and the G20 economies with respect to supply chain cohesion and congruence is also affecting the way economic prospects and supply chains are shaping, for example, in Bangladesh or in Vietnam or certain other countries of the world, which are outside the scope of the supply chains. And let's not forget that in addition to these ideas that firms now need to be resilient, they also have to cope with external demands that have come on them in terms of subscribing to new environmental standards and building digital capacities, which are further bigger challenges. Now, in this respect, what might be the way forward for the G20 and engagement arms like the B20? Perhaps the time has come, and this is just to echo on what Mr. Damodavi shared earlier. Perhaps the time has come to think of supply chains in a somewhat more inclusive fashion. And inclusive fashion doesn't necessarily mean that everybody has to come into supply chains, but there's probably a better bit of understanding required insofar as the supply chain breakups and their costs and their impacts are concerned. And it is important within the G20 community to reflect on how supply chains can be made to work a little bit more specifically towards the interests of the South and their producers and consumers. So in other words, how can they be made more attentive towards those from the South? This is just not important from the concept of inclusivity, but this is also important in ensuring a better global future, just to connect to the one world, one planet, one future theme. So the trade facilitation reforms have to progress in a manner in which such inclusivity is made possible. And I think it's very, very important the Honorable Minister here has been one of the architects of this initiative. Initiatives like multi-country initiatives like the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative, which Japan, India and Australia have proposed within the G20, or what India is working together with a number of other G20 partners within the space of the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum framework on the subject of supply chains. These are important to be taken forward as specimens of rules which are inclusive in nature and are able to minimize the costs of disruption as much as possible and enhance resilience to that extent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Palid. Thank you for highlighting the close interlinkage between GVCs and national priorities and for highlighting the specific vulnerabilities of the Global South that need to be a focus area for the deliberations of the B20. Thank you very much. Ms. Linda.
Good afternoon to the delegates gathered here today, and thank you CII that serves as the B20 Secretariat to organize this B20 Inception Meet, and greetings to all my fellow panelists. Over the last years, we have learned to cope with unprecedented levels of economic, social, and environmental uncertainties, as already has been pointed out by previous speakers. And as a result, supply chain disruptions have become an almost unavoidable parameter to manage when doing business. At Amphori, we bring together over 2,500 retailers, importers, brands, and associations from more than 40 countries, and enable responsible business conduct by offering programs, services, and tools supporting our members to manage their supply chain responsibly through environmental, social, and governance due diligence, and advocate for sustainable and open trade globally. And we call this trade with purpose. And purpose is an important word here. Amphori is an international, independent, not-for-profit business association. At the core of what we do is continuous improvement and capacity building. And also capacity building has been re-emphasized a few times already in this panel. You might know our environmental programs, BEPI, and our social program, Amphori BSCI. The theme for this year G20 under the India presidency is RACE, responsible, accelerated, innovative, sustainable, and equitable businesses. And I will focus on the S, sustainable, as we work towards building resilient global value chains that are inclusive and integrated. Technical and financial access remains important for value chains, no doubt. Sustainability is crucial for building the resilience of global supply chains. Sustainability is built on the ESG pillars, environment, social, and governance. And all three pillars need to be integrated into supply chains and supply chain due diligence to build this resilience. In situations of difficulties like the ones we have experienced over the course of recent years, COVID-19, global inflation, war, it's very tempting to see sustainability concerns as a luxury, which only some wealthy countries can afford, or wealthy businesses. But we are learning that for both wealthy and less wealthy countries, neglecting sustainability becomes a greater cost. At M4, we have found that businesses that were already putting quite some efforts in carrying out genuine due diligence efforts managed the difficulties much better and came out stronger. Through due diligence efforts, they had regular engagement, communication, and a long-term relationship with their partners and producers, and thus could better anticipate supply chain disruptions and adapt more quickly to that new reality together. Those who were sincere with their efforts and not just ticking the box found that due diligence served as a communication channel at a very complicated moment and helped build greater trust and confidence amongst today's consumers, shareholders, investors, and other stakeholders. And that is why investing time, money, resources, and efforts into improving the sustainability of global supply chain at such a difficult point proves to be a good choice and a recipe for success. One that could be perceived as counterintuitive, but which will actually benefit sustainable trade, competitiveness, and add value. However, placing ESG concerns at the core of business conduct and sustainable trade requires a supportive environment which rewards corporate due diligence efforts. Some efforts have already been made in that direction, but much remains to be done when it comes to harmonization and alignment with existing international standards and expectations. But this effort will not translate into any impact on the ground unless we build and reinforce local capacity and collaborate. Supply chains or global value chains are as strong as the weakest link. and each company should be capable and motivated to embrace sustainability as core part of its business strategy. There's a lot of wishes we have, whether that's on environmental, social, or governance, but the key thing here is harmonization, not reinvent the wheel, align and collaborate, and put sustainability first. Strengthening global value chains to become more sustainable and inclusive, and I have to make this remark, it's great to see two panels, or this panel, two women, so I think that's also, I would say, a good sign of inclusivity. But to become more sustainable and inclusive, it's everyone's responsibility in that supply chain. Collaboration is key, standards and expectations are clear, the red line is there, start acting now and move step by step to robust environmental, social and governance due diligence. Gathered here today, as we discuss the various steps needed to build resilience in value chain, I leave you with a quote from none other than Mahatma Gandhi. The future depends on what we do in the present. In summary, act now. Now is the time for us to act. Let's collaborate and build a strong future together. One Earth, one family, one future. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you for that very passionate stress on sustainability of the GVC along the three pillars of ESG for both wealthy and developing countries. We now welcome Ms. Shinta Kamdani, CEO of Syntesa Group, who also led the B20 Indonesia. She's joining us virtually. Welcome, Shinta. Over to you.
Thank you. Warmest regards to all of you in Gujarat. First of all, congratulations, India, for hosting the B20 2023 inception meeting. Allow me to extend my good cheers to Mr. Chandra Sekaran, the chair of B20 India, and our colleagues at CII. Having just finished our own cycle of B20, I know how much of hard work this must be for all of you. Though I might not be able to join you in person, please be assured that Indonesia will always be ready to support you throughout your B20 presidency, both as Triarcha as well as country with a long history of friendship with India. Ladies and gentlemen, when we talk about trade and global value chain in 2023, our top of mind might be the latest WTO projection on global trade growth, which was said to grow by merely 1% this year, thanks to lasting disruptions ranging from inflation and monetary tightening to high energy prices and continuous commodity supply disruption as a side effect of ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Along with this gloomy projection, we may also be reminded the fact that our global value chain are highly vulnerable of pandemic control policy, of geopolitical conflict and rivalries, as well as environmental disasters, drought, flood, wildfires, and so on, which adversely affect both the supply and demand side of GVC. I would argue that all of them are the tip of the iceberg, or problems that have surfacing as we have not sufficiently addressed the core problems in global trade and GVC. The core problems are current structure of the GVC, I believe, are not only the exposed vulnerabilities and short-term disruptions, but most importantly, it is the lack of diversification in trade and GVC, which we have developed over the past 2 decades. The diversification I want to address here, not only about the trading partners in terms of countries, but also about which businesses and what kind of trade we are engaged in the global value chain. Just a couple of weeks ago, McKinsey Global Institute revealed that 40% of the global trade is concentrated in a bad way, whereby importing economies rely on supply from 3 or fewer nations for this share of global trade, even when global supply options are diversified. While this condition contributes to the efficiency of GVC, all countries are vulnerable to even the smallest disruption in partner countries that are local in nature, it is not only referred to deliberate adoption of trade restrictive measures, but also refer to environmental catastrophe such as drought or flood, which may disrupt supply and demand of goods in GVC. To explore deeper, Global Value Chain Development Report in 2021 exposed that GVC participation rate has been continuously on a decline since its peak at 49.3% in 2018 to 44% in 2020, and GVC contribution to global GDP has also fallen from its peak at 14.6% in 2018 to 12.1% in 2020. While participation of certain countries in GVC has increased, GVC has failed to contribute to development beyond production, primarily because of the dominant role of MNC in the global value chain. While MSME represent 90% of the global enterprises, contribute more than half of the global employment and more than 40% of the GDP in emerging countries. At the same time, global services value chain marked by trade in intangible asset and intellectual property along with GVC remains concentrated among developed countries, even as global trade in goods is increasingly entangled with services trade primarily upon the rise of economic digitalization, which exacerbates concentration of GVC in a handful of countries and in turn makes it prone to disruption. In conclusion, GVC resilience in the future will not only require us to trade with more diversified trading partners or to supply goods from countries beyond our traditional trading partners. GVC resilience in the future are also required to be built upon greater participation of MSME and improved capabilities for emerging countries to participate in global services value chain. The need for MSME and emerging countries to participate more is not solely to ensure resilience or achieving economic inclusivity that we pledge for in SDG. Instead, it creates a new path of development, creating jobs, income, and improved scale to global economy. With uncertainties to global economic outlook and apparent burdens of global inflation, monetary tightening, and disrupted global commodity market, it is urgent and eminent for G20 countries to pioneer actions which may tangibly improve MSME participation in GVC and emerging countries' participation in the global service value chain. We can suggest many policy recommendations to this effect to our leaders, ranging from providing greater access to affordable trade, finance for MSME, to providing assistance for MSME to adopt to export through digital means. But let's not forget that the GVC that we want to reform requires coordination and close collaboration between the private and public sectors. We, the businesses, also play a part in creating an inclusive GVC. B20 Indonesia has started this effort through promotion of inclusive supply chain model, the inclusive closed loop, as a way for us, business, government, and civic communities to collectively empower MSME to be part of our domestic and global supply chain in any way we can. In action, B20 Indonesia also offers a platform, B20 Wiki, which facilitates small enterprises to be digital ready and capable to scale up, becoming mid-sized company through cross-country collaboration and participation in GVC. I would like to encourage all of us not only to adopt the inclusive closed-loop supply chain model or join us in the B20 Wiki, but also to build upon our initiative in B20 India. Together, I hope we can create upgraded tangible actions in ensuring growth through a greater global value chain inclusivity that we all need in overcoming the global economic slowdown this year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shinta. Thank you for the strong emphasis on vulnerability of GVCs to geopolitics and climate shocks, and the importance and emphasis you gave on diversification of GVCs to build resilience through greater participation of MSMEs and emerging countries, urging G20 countries to take some decisive steps forward. Thank you, Shinta, for that. May I now request our Minister of State, he would like to make a comment? Okay. I think both are Honorable Mr. Piyush Goyal and...
I think a lot has been said. And if after so many panelists, if somebody doesn't understand what resilient global value chains are, then I think businesses are in trouble in the future.
Thank you, sir. Would you like to make any opening comments, or shall I jump straight in? So, post my saying that the ministers, both of them would be happy to take questions, I have a bunch of names that have come up, and I'm going to first request Shinta. Shinta, are you still online there? So maybe you can go first. Is Shinta there? Is Shinta online? Would you like to go with your question first?
Yes, I have a question. I think as a chair of the G20, I believe India presidency look forward to create a difference, progress against multiple challenges which are persistent in the prior presidency. For example, reform of multilateral trading system, rules on digital trade, GVC inclusivity, etc., as well as those that uniquely happen in present time. For example, commodity price volatility, adverse effect of the geopolitical and so forth. In terms of trade, investment, and global value chain, what does India presidency look forward to address or create a specific progress on?
I think what I can understand after hearing all the panelists, and very clearly we all recognize that it's important to try and integrate like-minded countries into supply chains so that there's greater amount of trust and reliability that is available amongst the partners in a GVC. I think what India would like to do is try to look at the best practices across the world and see if we can create a template during our presidency, a template which can address the various elements of a resilient supply chain, a template that can help the less developed countries or the developing nations to relook at their own business processes, to try and converge their own way of working so that they can also get their fair share in global value chains. So when we talk of advancing inclusion or integration into global value chains, I think many countries would be in a position to add a lot of value. Take, for example, the Pacific Island nations. In fact, Indonesia itself, with the thousands of islands that you have, there could be many strategic locations which could become very, very nice logistics hubs, where there could be value addition also, and from where we could have a wider dispersion of goods, possibly even services across the world. So chances of integrating the less developed countries will significantly increase if we can create a small template, easy to use, more like FAQs and a compilation of best practices, which can then help us to reach out to other countries, less developed countries, encourage them to participate with their offerings. Everybody will not be aptly suitable for every value chain, but different countries would have different things to offer, and that is in fact the beauty of global value chains.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ashinta. Thank you, sir. Thank you. I think Ms. Linda Kromjong has also a question to ask. Linda, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you. And thank you very much for allowing this interactive session. I think it's great. Also allow me to correct the screen we were on this panel, so I just made an error there. I think that's also great. Coming back to small and medium enterprises, everyone says that's where we need to focus on. Not only the larger companies, but also the small. Everyone should step up. But we know that small and medium enterprises have the will to do so, but not necessarily always the resources or the capacity. We know the importance of capacity building, but also the importance of building long-term relationships. But how are we going to incorporate that in legislation, that if and when new legislation is being proposed, that should drive sustainability for everyone, for all companies, that small and medium enterprises get the help they need in a very, say, actionable manner? What are your thoughts there under your presidency?
I think by and large, my own experience has been that it's always around an anchor, around a larger unit, that the MSMEs flourish. So for every one, let's say, Apple plant that will come up, there'll be 1,000+ units from the MSME sector who will flourish and create the ecosystem that Apple would require. And to my mind, MSMEs per se are so agile, are full of enthusiasm. Very often they've learned the hard way, they've grown the hard way, and therefore they are able to adapt to circumstances far better than the large corporations. Large corporations are more difficult to move. You tell a large company to become net zero, they'll start from a planning stage which may take a few years. You tell a small company, a young entrepreneur, he'll adapt much quicker. He'll come up with out-of-the-box ideas. His solutions will be more practical on the ground and coming from his own day-to-day experiences, and his decision-making ability is always better. So I would think what I would do if we were to try and help the MSME sector also get into more value chains, or adopt practices, for example, around sustainability. What we would need to do is, again, let the larger companies handhold some of the smaller companies. Let them make them a part of their own plans. So if the larger company is planning their pathway to a net zero world, they would be responsible for helping the MSMEs associated with them. So if Baba Kalyani is running a large food shop, but he has suppliers of molds and dyes, he has suppliers, your TAFE would have suppliers of all sorts of different products. Now TAFE would then be responsible for integrating the entire ecosystem and helping them adopt modern practices, the best of practices, helping understand their woes. Forget becoming part of global value chains. When the large companies, and many of us here represent large companies, when we work with these small companies, and I say this because I myself have run a very small unit, and I know the number of difficulties we used to face when we were supplying to the large companies, or when we were trying to get product approval from a large company. I think in the first stage, what we should be doing is kind of sensitizing the larger companies that within your own ecosystem, look at your own ecosystem as a mini value chain, supply value chain, and see how we can make it easier to operate vis-a-vis the small companies and the larger companies. And then that will percolate at a much larger level when we are talking of global value chains. Ultimately, a lot of the paperwork which can be eliminated, a lot of the, when we are looking at global value chains, the border management or custom processes which can be made simpler, and then technology can be an overlay on this simplification process. When we look at infrastructure, there are times where I think now companies have started creating their supply ecosystem around their plant and even using conveyor belts to get just-in-time inventory. While COVID, I did hear a few voices against JIT, but I think that's that initial reaction people have. We'll get back to that. Ultimately, costs will force us to get back to JIT and force us to have more efficient ecosystems in our businesses. The same will go for global value chains. After all, if a country like Singapore has been able to play an important role as a trading hub, it may be a good idea for some of us to do a deep dive study, figure out what did they do right, and then around that, recognizing the limitations of a less developed country. We can create the basic ideas around which MSMEs also can be supported. It will involve some infrastructure development, possibly addressing challenges of logistics. But the important thing that MSMEs bring to the table is trust. One good thing about an MSME is once they are associated into a chain, whether within the company or with a large company or with an international chain, you can usually trust a small person because his bread and butter and his very existence is dependent on being a part of that chain. So they will bring to the table trust, which to my mind is one of the most important elements of any value chain, domestic, intra-company or international.
Thank you, sir. MSMEs is going to continue to be a very hotly debated topic during our first discussions. A lot more needs to be done, a lot more can be done. I think as corporates, we take that responsibility for our supply chains. We do. A lot more in terms of upskilling, in terms of access to finance, and in terms of maybe digital platforms that will help better information sharing, better access to markets. All of these are just a few ideas that one could think of, but certainly an area of work for all countries in GVCs. Over to you, Afil.
Afternoon, Minister. The Make in India program that your government conceived and has executed has been a great success, especially for the domestic market. Can you share with us any policies or programs that you are working on that will integrate India, now that our competitiveness has improved, that can help India integrate into these global value chains, be it large companies, small companies, attracting MNCs, whatever you may have?
Very good question. In fact, that's one of the primary focus of our work in the last few months, possibly going into a couple of years. We recognized that what the world is looking for is, when we are integrating different industries or businesses, is the same kind of ecosystem and the same kind of infrastructure that they are used to being available for their value chains. Take, for example, a simple thing like quality standards. If we in India do not adopt and harmonize our quality standards with the rest of the world, it will be very difficult for international companies to really get India into the value chain. If we do not create logistics or infrastructure to make our logistics nimble, fast, and easy to work with, it's going to be difficult for global chains to accept India within their framework. And therefore, our focus has been on trying to make the country's mindset accept quality as the most important factor in the success story that we want and we wish to see in India. To my mind, if the other day, a very, very large investor and somebody who owns some of the companies which are sitting in this room also here was at dinner with me after a business round table, and he asked me, what is the one thing that keeps you awake at night? And I said, my ability or inability to be able to get my country to accept quality as the most important factor that will define our success story. And along with quality will come harmonization of standards, setting global benchmarks when it comes to consumers' expectations from whatever goods and services they are buying. Because unless we in India start becoming more demanding of quality, our businesses, our manufacturers, our service providers will never realize how important that is even for the world market. And you can't have different quality standards for India and for the rest of the world. There was a time when if this bottle was being made in India, and many of my Indian friends here would remember it, there would be a label on the top, export quality. Do you recall that? This is export quality, which means there was another set of bottles which was probably less quality, which was for the domestic market. Until we get rid of that, we are never going to be able to become a very serious player in the world market. And towards that end, we are working for harmonizing our standards, for making our consumers very much more conscious of the quality that they should be demanding. We are focusing even on government accepting service standards of how we are going to serve our people. So we are setting up benchmarks for government to perform. Of course, along with that then comes the other associated issues like ease of doing business, decriminalizing laws, reducing the compliance burden. Unless we are able to create that ecosystem, which as I said is simple, which has speed, which is easy to operate in, we really won't be able to offer ourselves as a trusted and resilient partner. Having said that, I must take pride in the work that all my colleagues from India, both in the manufacturing and service side, have demonstrated to the world during COVID. COVID was a testing time, and it actually showed the world where different countries and companies stand. And I say with pride that India is one country. There surely must be others also. I'm not saying the only country. I'm saying is one important country that never, through the period of COVID, particularly the 2.5 years of very serious concerns around COVID, India and its business partners, our business players, never let down a single business commitment that we made to the rest of the world. We quickly rejigged our processes. We quickly moved our service providers into homes, even during the strictest lockdown. We had broadband connectivity given overnight. We moved equipment to people's homes. And fortunately, Digital India had started in 2015, due to which we had very good connectivity throughout the country. So we were able to meet every service commitment, particularly on the services side, without a single minute of disruption. Similarly, on goods, export-oriented units were given special dispensation to operate for their export commitments. Movement of goods was allowed liberally. There was not a single day of power failure, so the trains kept chugging day and night, moving material, particularly coal and oil and gas, so that throughout the country, not for a single day we had an energy shortage. Unlike some of the most developed countries, not one food store, not one departmental store was ransacked or had to face any sort of law and order problem, because food was ensured throughout the length and breadth of the country, very often at people's doorstep. So we had no law and order problem, no starvation, no international commitment not being met, and that today is being recognized the world over as India's strength, and that is what resilience is all about.
Thank you. Thank you. Fantastic. Thank you so much. And we have very little time. We have so many questions more, but I'll just take 2, 3, if it's okay with you. I'll take 2, 3 very quick questions. We have Mr. Abdelaziz Mohammed Humaid, Assistant Director General for Communication and Business Sector of the Chamber of Commerce from Sharjah. May I request you to ask your question?
Thank you very much. It was really a very comprehensive.
Can you hold the mic like this closer to your mouth?
Sorry, can you hear me now much better? Thank you very much for today's contribution in this event. My question will be on the same matter, but it will go on the CEPA agreement. Now, the value chain is a very big topic, whereas there is a lot of companies, or let's say on the SMEs level, they were having issues during the pandemic time that all the logistics were closed. So my question would be providing SME with more support to access financials. Would it encourage their integration and participation in the global value chain under the UAE-India CEPA?
Well, I think both the UAE and India recognize that when we concluded the CEPA, the biggest beneficiary will be SMEs on both sides. The fact of life is that UAE is relatively a smaller country and again a very, very efficient country in terms of its own supply chains. But because of its own internal dynamics, we understand that our MSME to MSME cooperation is going to really be the strength of this CEPA. So we have a track on which we are engaged with each other. We do believe that the MSMEs in India have good opportunities there and vice versa. We've drawn up plans for ways and means to look at the UAE also as a springboard or a transit point to all of Africa, some parts of Europe, the other GCC countries. So we think this CEPA is going to help add value to companies on both sides and help us expand our engagement. We are in dialogue with some of your larger companies to see how they can play the catalyst role. For example, DP World. If they can play a catalyst role like an aggregator to help us get a number of MSME units, small units, integrated and get an outlet or a facility to be able to meet the needs of each other's countries. So we are in dialogue with special larger companies who can help these smaller companies leverage the best out of the CEPA. Thank you.
Thank you. That's noticed.
Thank you. We have two more requests, but I'm going to request Narayan as the last request to make one, and Kamal Bali is also here. So both of you, if you could put your questions together, Kamal and Narayan, and then we can get the Minister to answer that one.
Thank you. Honorable Minister, from morning we've been having various examples of Indian platforms which can be showcased to the world during the whole G20 presidency. So one example I have is what your ministry has started, which is the Export District Hub. We've been talking about inclusivity. Can we use that as a platform for promoting inclusiveness among the Indian MSMEs and also showcasing that as an example of a national initiative?
This was something that the Prime Minister came up with a few years ago. And honestly, to all of us in this room, it's surprising that despite being in business for so many years, none of us ever thought of it. He said, do you have an idea where the exports from India are going? And he said, yeah, we certainly know which are the hubs. We know Tirupur is a hub for textiles. We know petrochemicals go from Gujarat. He said, no, but the country has 700 plus districts. What about the larger parts and the remoter parts of the country? How much does each district recognize that they also have a role to play in exports? And we realize, forget districts, even states don't consider it their duty. Even states don't feel involved in the internationalization of Indian economy. They don't understand, they don't recognize that the more there is international trade from their state, that much more economic activity, jobs, taxes, all of that will come into their state. So we started at the first stage with mapping what different states contribute to the global effort. Then we took it down to the districts. So today, what is exported from each district in the whole country is mapped. At any point of time, I know today what is the figure of exports from Shravasti in UP. Doubt any of you have even heard of that name. His idea was, once we know which district exports what, we'll be able to identify what is the speciality of that district. After all, if Moradabad can export brassware, it's a speciality that they have cultivated over a period of time, in fact over generations. So can we start recognizing every district for a product or one or two products which are unique to that district? And Tirupur, for example, in your state got recognized for its textile apparel export. Morbi in Gujarat, in our state where we are, got recognized for ceramic export. And we've mapped the entire country, and by the way, most of the gift packs that each one of you will take back when you go will have a one district, one product gift for each one of us. From there emerged the idea that now that we have the databases of what's special to each of the districts, can we promote this product across the world? So we suddenly had a remote district in Tripura starting to export products which were unheard of, or a district in Bihar exporting a new product. Tripura was pineapples, but each pineapple was this big and really juicy. We didn't even know that there is a thing like a Tripura specific high quality pineapple, extremely sweet. Bihar started exporting lychee, another fruit. What I'm just trying to share with you is that we are now looking at each district and its potential to emerge as a exporting hub, which we call a district as an export hub, DH. And we are now building up our relationship at the district level, both with state administration, district administration, and businesses, to see how we can help connect them with the world markets and make each district recognize its role in a way, somewhat like a global supply value chain. How they can become a part of international value chains and start capturing world markets.
Kamal, I was hoping you were going to combine that question with Narayan's, but go ahead. Just
I can let it pass then. I can let
Go quickly.
Okay, a quick one. I think, as we all know, due to the rebalancing of the global value chain, the Indian manufacturing, especially component exports, are really growing at a very fast pace even during these times. But going forward, we believe in the next 2 to 3 years, some of these, especially MSMEs, are going to face some kind of a pressure on account of the proposed carbon tax and some other measures. So just to ensure that our MSMEs don't lose out on this, we need to help them to speed up their circularity and sustainability measures by incentivizing them suitably. So that's one thought. I thought I'll leave a reflection with you.
Well, I think that's truly music to my ears. If we can start sensitizing and making more and more people aware in our own ecosystems also about the importance of sustainability, of this challenge of climate change, and socialize or democratize the importance of this global effort to tackle climate change, half the battle will be won. And in that incentivizing, sadly, and I'm one of those who's totally against this word subsidy and incentive, and what more can you give us so that we do this? This is our duty. This is going to be the very survival of business and mankind. And therefore, I think more and more MSMEs are getting more conscious. But I would urge the larger businesses to take this up also as their responsibility. So while we hear a lot of talk about large corporations announcing that we will be net zero by 2040 or 2050 or thereabouts, I think that we should now hear some voices, and maybe Volvo can start by saying that Volvo will be net zero by year X, and Volvo's ecosystem of suppliers, including our MSME suppliers, will be net zero by year X plus 5 years, 7 years, whatever. So food for thought for your next board meeting, my friend.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. And as we come to the end of a very, very interesting session, let me say, on behalf of all of you, express my warm thanks to to the Honorable Minister, to the Minister of State, and to all my speakers for a very engaging, interactive discussions, for your suggestions on approaches for the task force to take, and to each of our speakers for sharing your valuable insights. And I look forward to speakers, of course, sharing more inputs at our task force meetings as well. So thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you everyone for sharing your insightful input. And we request everyone to kindly step forward for the group photograph. Thank you. The next session is on fostering financial inclusion and empowering societies. Financial inclusion together with financial education are essential components for supporting the financial resilience and well-being of individuals, families and communities. While considerable progress has been made over the years, it is estimated that more than 1.7 billion adults still remain without